We came together, and so far what we've done is we've worked with our international partners like Baitul Mal and FRDP, as well as ACP at Dode, to implement clean water wells within areas in rural Sindh. So may that be Thar, Larkana, and we're trying to branch away from that this semester mainly because we're trying to come up with a way in which we can implement reverse osmosis. So that not just water wells, but we're thinking of the bigger picture in the grand scheme of the socio-ecological model. So that's what I do in my extracurricular. It takes up a bunch of my time. And it's also public health, because at the end of the day, we're addressing population level water crises. And then apart from that, I also do research on vaccine preventable diseases. So vaccine preventable diseases are diseases ranging from polio, measles, influenza. These are diseases that could be spread from people to people. The difference between vaccine preventable diseases and other diseases is the main mode of transmission is the individual. So for example, cancer is a non-communicable disease because cancer cannot be transmitted from person to person. It depends more on your lifestyle, genetics, environment, and a lot of things come into play. So the reason I'm focusing on vaccine preventable diseases with my major is because I think that a lot of people, specifically people in developing nations, are very susceptible to infectious diseases. And I feel that in Western nations that are more developed, quote unquote, folks have forgotten that these diseases still exist in these countries. Polio is the biggest example that I can think of, and smallpox as well. America and the UK have eradicated these diseases, but nations like China, India, and Pakistan are still suffering, and it's usually the people in low income that are suffering the most. So my research involves how can we do what America and the UK did, except in Pakistan, and me being a member of the Pakistani community, how can I implement it in a sustainable way? So that's the whole thing about vaccines. And then something that my dad enjoys when I talk about a lot is that I'm actually also very involved in politics in America. I think that politics is really important and it affects us in every day. Recently, the Trump administration had proposed a Muslim ban within 7 main countries, ranging from Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Yemen, all these countries. So I'm a certified organizer in the Muslim ban strategy that the Trump administration implemented, and what I do is I not only protest, but I advocate for Muslims in Michigan specifically, and I register them to vote, and I let them know what their rights are as immigrants, as residents, as citizens of the United States. And I think that this is important because once we give Muslims in that nation a voice to speak out against the injustices that they're being faced with, only then we can all make a change. I mean, I'm seeing the same rhetoric here in Pakistan as well. People are they hate being quiet. They're not rebelling, but they're speaking up on the injustices that they're being faced, whether that be like tomatoes are costing like $100 rupees more than they are now. So that's what I do in my free time. And then that little Bernie slogan, Bernie is the presidential candidate running for 2020 general elections, and I also work on his campaign. So there's a lot going on here, but I just wanted to let you guys know a little bit of my background and that apart from school, these are the other things that I'm doing just to give back to my community and be more integrated when it comes to interventions and specifically public health interventions. So I wanted to emphasize the 3 P's of public health as well before getting into the crux of my presentation, just because when we go into public health, or when I come to Pakistan and I tell aunties and uncles yeah, I'm studying public health, they go oh, aap to pre-med track mein hai, or you're going to be a doctor. And I'm like, no, that is not what I'm going to be, and that's not what public health is. So I'm having this conversation with you all in the hopes that you can tell your aunties and uncles that this is what public health is and has nothing to do with medicine. So the 3 P's of public health are something that they promote in our school specifically. Like the second you transfer as a freshman in your first year, you have to literally memorize this, and whenever someone asks you what public health is, you just stick to the 3 P's. So in all my personal statements, essays for grad school, I've been writing that public health means to promote preserve, and protect the health of populations. And that's why I'm going to focus right here. I wish the little flashlight was working, but prevention versus treatment. So the difference between medicine and public health is that we're not treating populations, or we're not treating individuals. We're preventing the disease from happening in the first place. And that's a very big aspect of public health, and that's why public health is basically everything. And by prevention, I'm going to go back in my storytelling to my vaccine work. So I'm implementing vaccines for measles and hopefully polio one day, because I want people to get vaccinated so they don't have to be treated for these diseases, and so that they're not susceptible to be infected by these diseases. So that's the really big distinction between medicine and public health. Another is population versus individual. We're not having one-on-one encounters with our so-called patients. We're going into communities and we're talking to masses of people, and we're trying to spread our message to communities and populations versus individuals. And that kind of makes it more difficult to develop a relationship with the community that we're serving. But I believe that it's a very important distinction between medicine and public health. And then I wanted to talk about where this fits in with my future professional and personal goals. So when I don't know if all of you know this, but I was born in Pakistan and then I immigrated to the United States with my family at the age of 4. And then I spent most of my developmental time in America. Like, I did elementary school, middle school, all in America. And then one day my father came home one day and he was like, okay, I got a job in Pakistan, so we're all moving back. And for a 13-year-old, that was a little bit hard to grasp, because the culture that had been enrooted in my head was obviously American Western culture. All my friends were in America. I couldn't think of going back to Pakistan because what was I going to do there? But both my brothers at that time were entering university, so they got to stay there, and I came back to Pakistan with my parents. When I was in Pakistan, I witnessed a lot of stark disparities that were existing. Like, I remember that my driver would pick me up from my school, which was in Phase 8, and we would be going over this underpass towards Clifton area, and I would see, like, people are driving in BMWs and Mercedes-Benz, whereas, like, downstairs, underneath the bridge, there's, like, shanty hometowns. And I prefer the term shanty hometowns versus slums, because I think slums is a very derogatory term. I feel that shanty hometowns is something that can be fixed and addressed if we implement the right policy. But when I noticed that, I was like, why are these people in poverty? Why are they suffering more than the higher 1%? And it took a lot of soul searching and a lot of conversations with my professors and my brothers and my mom and dad to realize that there's a field called public health, which actually addresses the root systemic issues that exist as to why people are dengue fever. Within 3 to 5 days, population level numbers can be affected with it. So I feel and I believe that infectious diseases are the most important, because I feel that Western nations have forgotten that infectious diseases are important, because they're not necessarily facing the same diseases that people here are facing. I mean, we had a measles outbreak this past summer, but really infectious diseases like malaria and polio that are actually killing mothers and increasing the child mortality rate. I feel like it's important to address those the most. So if I had to rank, I would rank that. But every professional has a different opinion on what's the most important to them. Is there any other questions? No?
Why not the generally health as an issue? Why focusing only on the infectious disease?
But don't you think that all of this would be the general health issues? Not all of this, obviously it's not an exhaustive list, but wouldn't all, like, doesn't infectious diseases affect general health?
You need a healthy individual in order to improve your society.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not only those particularly those infectious diseases.
But won't the infectious diseases not make the individual healthy? Like, it won't make the individual able to perform all of their duties. Like, if you're lying in bed sick with a fever that you don't know is dengue yet because you haven't been diagnosed, you won't be able to go to work, you won't be able to go to get groceries to feed your family. So at the end of the day, infectious diseases make you immobile, thereby affecting not only you, but the health of individuals. And if you're not in quarantine, you can pass that disease onto any other person as well around you. So, I mean, it's not the most, general health is obviously important, but infectious disease is the most dangerous because it can be spread to populations of people. Does that make sense? Anyone else?
I think why are you so quiet, all of you? I mean, either you are understanding it very deeply or you're not. It's either or. I don't know. थोड़ा गौर से सुन रहे हो आप लोग, पता नहीं क्या करोगे मुझे. But yeah, go ahead. Let's finish. I thought you were saying half an hour, more than half an hour already.
I guess I learned from you.
Right.
Okay. So now I'm going to talk about the iatrogenic effect of colonizers in South Asia. And I'm going to only touch upon this briefly
What do you
because...
mean by iatrogenic?
Yeah, I'm going to explain what iatrogenic is. I didn't know what it was until my junior year of college, but one of my professors, and now he's a really good mentor of mine and also my boss for the research that I do, he explained what iatrogenic means. Like, he came up to me one day when I was doing research, and he sat me down, he said, Umaima, what is your bigger goal in life? Like, you're here, you're studying, you're doing research, which is like very amazing on infectious diseases, but what is your bigger goal? What can you do that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is not doing, like, essentially? So then he introduced me to what iatrogenic effect means, because I've been reading case studies about what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing with regards to polio, with regards to influenza, with regards to malaria and all these terrible infectious diseases that are happening in South Asia. But these interventions are not lasting, like they're not sustainable, meaning public health workers from these foundations that don't look anything like us, I mean, they're Americans, right? They're entering these spaces in South Asia and they're implementing the intervention, but then as soon as they see their data that's being collected, they leave right away. So they're not necessarily waiting in that space until the intervention can become sustainable so that doctors and professionals in that area can address the intervention on its own. So the main reason I wanted to focus on community-based research is because you have to know who you're serving and you have to teach them how to serve themselves, if that makes sense. So an iatrogenic effect means that people are doing more harm than they are good, meaning their mindset is in the right place. In the end of the day, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing amazing, incredible work, but their mindset is good. They want to eradicate all infectious diseases from all the developing nations in the world, but they're not. And why aren't they? Because their interventions are not sustainable. Because, I don't know what that saying is, but like, teach a man how to fish and he can feed his entire family, but just buy him one fish and he'll probably be hungry the next day. And that's where iatrogenic effect comes in. Like, you want to teach these people how to prevent diseases from happening, and you want to explain healthy behavior to them, rather than just coming into a space and implementing an intervention and just leaving the next day because you got the numbers that you wanted. So iatrogenic effect is something that's very important to me, and now I've been starting to focus on it more and more, because my professor said the only way that you will be able to do anything or move beyond anywhere, whether that be in public health or any other field that you do, I'm also pre-law, so I'm going to be a lawyer one day, hopefully, is if you think about how iatrogenic effect is impacting a lot of people and why these interventions aren't sustainable. So I guess, like, I'll just leave you guys with that. Like, think about it. Like, why hasn't polio been eradicated in India or in Pakistan? I mean, obviously the government and people who are like anti-vaccines are a huge role, but it's because nobody's teaching these people how to prevent it from happening in the first place. They're just coming and leaving, and nobody knows what to do. They're not actually sitting down and having conversations. So I guess that's what I mean by iatrogenic effect, and it's a very big part of my research as well as vaccines. And now this is like the main part of my talk. So I'm going to talk about traditional versus CVPR approach in interventions. So traditional research focuses on the community, which is a passive subject. So for example, like, I come into Larkana and I'm just looking at the community and I'm observing them and I'm studying them and I'm writing down data that they're participating in these healthy behaviors, these unhealthy behaviors every day. Versus CBPR, which involves the community in being studying, which means I'm going into Larkana and I'm not observing, but I'm talking and involving them. I'm talking to them to help me understand, like which people should I be reaching out to and which people are at most risk. Because general health is important, but you have to address people who are at most risk, which are people living in low-income households and people who don't have access to basic goods and services. And then you have research design, which is done primarily by an academic institution. So universities like Harvard, Yale, even University of Michigan, they conduct research. They're primarily public research institutions, which is why when you transfer into these universities, your first year they tell you, find a professor and do research with that professor, because they're accredited by all these major journals like Lancet Journal and Institute of Medicine. But the research design in CBPR is done with representatives from the community and that academic institution. So that means I'm going into Larkana and I'm pinpointing a few individuals, but these individuals are also going to help me in designing my study and my research question, because they know best. Because I don't know much about Larkana. I mean, I visit there every now and again, but I don't know which diseases are prevalent and who's being affected by them. And then we collect a needs assessment, which is very important. A needs assessment is basically identifying the problem, identifying the population that's being impacted by the problem, explaining the prevalence of the problem, collecting data on the problem, and then finally coming up with an intervention that addresses this problem with the target population. So all of that with data collection, all of that and the implementation is done by the academic institution in traditional. But in CBPR, which is community-based participatory research, all of that happens with everyone. Like, it's everyone's responsibility to ensure that the problem is being identified and that the target population who is at most risk of the problem is also being identified by everyone, not just by people in power and by people who have a degree, quote unquote. We want to involve everyone and equal the playing field for everybody who's involved. And then we have obviously sustainability, which is never included in traditional approaches, which is why most public health interventions fail, because nobody's thinking about long-term sustainability. But then in CBPR, the difference is sustainability is a major priority. So right now, I'm applying for multiple grants to be funded for Paani as well as for my own vaccine research. And in the grant proposals, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, UNICEF, all these large institutions want you to address sustainability within the first half. You only have 500 words in these grant proposals, but at least in 30 words, you have to explain to them why your intervention is going to be sustainable. So sustainability is like a major part now like in 2020, going into 2020 with like most public health interventions. But it basically says one cannot expect positive results from an educational or political action program which fails to respect the particular view of the world held by the people. Such a program constitutes cultural invasion, good intentions notwithstanding. And I think that's it.